1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Y'all didn't know I could count, did you? We're going to be looking at, let me see what we're going to look at first. Mark chapter 8. And I want to see if we've got the slides from last week left over from last week. Is that slide still on there? That PowerPoint should be something like the earthly ministry of Christ or something to that effect. And I do have 6 outlines. If anybody doesn't have an outline, same one we passed out last 2 or 3 weeks. So if you need one, raise your hand. If you've already got one, this is $1. But if you don't have one, it's free. You made it back, Brother BJ. We enjoyed a few days up at the Arnold congregation just south of St. Louis. And just a wonderful lectureship up there, PTP Spark lecture series. And I made a comment when I spoke that the singing in the evenings was just incredible. And I shared with the audience that many years ago I had a dream, an audio dream. I heard the angels in heaven singing, and I'd never heard anything that intense and such harmony till I heard this singing at the PTP Spark series. It was really incredible. Some beautiful songs, beautiful singing, and great lessons. All right, we are in Mark. We're going to look at Mark chapter 8. Let me see where I'm at on this. Wait a minute, I'm not pushing the button. Don't get ahead of me here. There we go. No, that's not even. Yeah, Mark 8. But I'm going to start with verse 22 through 26. Let me take a look at this outline because I'm not sure that I've got everything in here that agrees with what Brother Mark Reynolds was using, and I'm trying to coordinate the two to make sure that I get everything in here. We're in the Great Galilean Ministry still. In fact, it's the greatest amount of material you have in the Gospels is in the what we call the Synoptic Gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The greatest amount of material is in the Galilean ministry. And so you'll see on the sheet as you go through this a number of incidences and points under the great Galilean ministry. Mark chapter 8, verse 22 through 26. A little bit of disagreement in here on the arrangement, but we left off last week. We actually left off last week with number 46, 45, 46. And I tried to point out that as the antagonism on the part of the Pharisees increased, Jesus was forced to go into seclusion, to go aside, not out of a lack of courage, but out of the realization that he was on the Father's timetable. And things were going to play out according to his schedule and not the schedule of the enemies. And so he would have to go into isolation from time to time, but he never ceased to preach and teach. He goes up to Tyre and Sidon, and then he goes over into Decapolis, and he just keeps preaching. But the majority of the audience, by the time he gets over into Decapolis, they're Gentiles. There's still some Jews who are dogging his trail, the Pharisees, but there are basically Gentiles. The only reason I want to look at this miracle in Mark chapter 8 is because of the unique nature of it. And there are varying opinions as to exactly where this appears in the chronological order. And we keep reminding ourselves that the gospel writers did not write a chronological record of the life of Christ. That wasn't their intention. Each one of the gospel writers wrote with a theme in mind, and Matthew almost ignores chronology altogether. Luke is a close second to John. I think John is the most chronological, and Luke is probably the second most chronological. But even with that, you have difficulties trying to harmonize some of these. Mark chapter 8. Let's look at verses 22 and following. They come unto Bethsaida. They bring to him a blind man and beseech him to touch him. And he took hold of the blind man by the hand, brought him out of the village, and when he had spit on his eyes, he laid his hands upon him, and he asked, Seest thou aught? And he looked up and said, I see men, for I behold them as trees walking. And then there's a second stage in this miracle. Then again he laid his hands upon his eyes, and he looked steadfastly, and was restored and saw all things clearly. I've heard a number of really good explanations on this. Some think that Jesus performed it in two stages in order to solicit the faith of the individual, the faith of the man who was being healed. Brother Stephen Lloyd, who is the director at the Southwest School of Biblical Studies, about 5 or 6 years ago, he came forward with a very interesting and intriguing position on this, and one that I think has a lot of merit to it. If the man was blind, he wouldn't be able to distinguish objects just by sight if he was given his sight. There was a movie probably 20 years ago of a true story of a man who was given his sight, and they would place a Coca-Cola can in front of him, and he had no idea what that was. But if he touched it and felt what it was, he'd know it was a soda pop. That may be something similar to what Jesus does here. He restores his sight first of all, and then he comes behind that and he gives him the knowledge of all things so he can see clearly. Each one of the miracles by themselves would have been astonishing, but when you combine the two of them, it makes for a very remarkable incident, does it not? Well, in verse 26, he sent him away to his home, saying, Do not even enter into the village. And if our chronology is right on this, and he is, of course, facing opposition from the Pharisees, Jesus would want to keep all of this as quiet as possible. If you'll look further down on your list, if you happen to have your list, fourth withdrawal to the eastern side of the lake, that would have been over into the area in Decapolis. And then moving on to the number 46, we have Peter's great confession at Caesarea. And this is verses 13 and following in Matthew. And I was almost tempted just to skip this because we're so familiar with it. But the more I thought about it, you never know who's in the audience. There may be some who have never been exposed to what is being taught here. And it's always good for us to refresh our memory, is it not, and the things that are there, and to remind us where certain truths are located. Let's start reading with verse 13. If I were going to place this in chronological sequence, I would say that probably you're somewhere in the vicinity of the second year of Jesus, maybe 2.5 years. And he has spent time with his apostles. They've seen the miracles that he has performed. They've sat at his feet and listened to the great wisdom that he preaches and teaches. And they are convinced that Jesus is the Messiah. So much so, you remember back in chapter 6 in John, when he talked about him being the bread of life, and even some of his disciples turned and walked no more with him. But these men stayed with Jesus because they were convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus was the Messiah. And that's why Peter would speak out there in John chapter 6, To whom shall we go? You have the words of life. They were convinced that he was the Son of God. Now let's see how this develops in verse 13. And James Kaufman has an interesting thought on this. In fact, he develops the same thought not only in his commentary on Matthew, but even in Luke. And he thinks that perhaps the disciples were being influenced by the negative teaching of the Pharisees. Certainly they had to be compelled after the feeding of the 5,000 to go to the other side of the lake. But to what degree it was having an effect upon the disciples at this point, I think it's a lessening effect. Brother Kaufman is anywhere close to what he thinks is the case. Start reading with verse 13. Now when Jesus came into the parts of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, Who do men say that the Son of Man is? Now there's a great question, isn't it? Who is Christ? A lot of people say he's a good prophet, good teacher, but they fall short of declaring him to be the divine Son of God. If a person confesses, if he, in his mind, the good confession is, I'm going to confess and say that Jesus is Lord, I don't think that goes far enough, because you can confess any man to be your Lord, to be superior to you, one whom you serve, but it's different to be able to say he's the Son of God, that he has a divine nature about him. Who do men say that the Son of Man is? And you can walk out of these doors and go up and down the streets of Collierville or Memphis or any other city in the United States, or even the world for that matter, and you'll get all kinds of opinions as to who Jesus is. Who do men say that he is? And they said, some say John the Baptist. Well, that would be John the Baptist come back from the dead. There was a superstition that when a person came back from the dead, that he could perform great powers and miracles. And that would make sense then, why some would think this is John the Baptist raised from the dead. I don't recall ever reading of John the Baptist doing any miracles, do you? So if Jesus came following in the steps of John, they were contemporaries for a while, and he's performing great miracles, then if that superstition had any kind of widespread acceptance, then you can understand why they would say he's John the Baptist. Some say he's Elijah. It was prophesied that the Messiah would come in the spirit of Elijah. So some were concluding, well, maybe this is Elijah. And others say Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. Of all the prophets, Jeremiah is selected. And when I look at Jeremiah, I've had the privilege to teach Jeremiah in the school now for 3 years. And when I look at Jeremiah, he was so much like Christ. He made great sacrifices. And yet there was that deep burning desire within his heart to keep doing the Father's will. Have you ever noticed in the book of John how often it is said from the lips of Jesus, I do the Father's will, I say what the Father tells me to say? He believed in doing what God commanded him to do. So some thought he was Jeremiah, one of the prophets, and he said to them, but who do you say that I am? You've seen the evidence, you've seen the miracles, now who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered and said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. So he includes the title and the official position, thou art the Christ, the Messiah, the one who would come. But in addition to that, you are the Son of the living God, which entails the divine aspect of Jesus. Turn back to Matthew chapter 1 for a moment. I wish we had time just to pursue a lot of these scriptures, but if we're going to get this finished before the end of October, we're going to really have to crank it up here. Look, if you will, at verse 21 and following. And he shall, well, let's back up to verse 20. Matthew 1, verse 20. When he thought on these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, fear not to take unto thee Mary thy wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. And she shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus, which means the one who saves. For it is he that shall save his people from their sins. Now all this has come to pass that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, behold, the virgin shall conceive, or the virgin shall be with child, and shall bring forth a son. This is the Greek word for virgin, parthenos. This is a divine commentary on Isaiah 7:14. Therefore, I conclude that Isaiah 7:14 is not a young woman, but a virgin that would give birth. That's another study in itself, and a remarkable one. But I want you to look at the last part of verse 20. They shall call his name Emmanuel, which is God with us. Can I suggest to you that had Jesus been born of natural parentage, there's no way it could have been said that he is God with us. It's impossible. He had to be born of a virgin. And the disciples are recognizing that, grasping that truth. So let's go back to Matthew chapter 16. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Peter said, Simon Peter answered and said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said unto him, blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this unto thee, which means this was not a human philosophy that was obtained in the University of Jerusalem or anywhere else for that matter. This was divine revelation that taught the disciples this truth. Flesh and blood did not reveal it unto thee, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say unto thee that thou art Peter. There's a play on words here. Thou art Peter, Petros. If we spelled that with English letters, we would spell it Petros, which is masculine, which describes just a little pebble, something you can pick up and you can throw. Now listen to this. Thou art Peter, and upon this rock, Petros, if we were to spell that with English, it would be an A. And that's the feminine, which refers to an immovable slab. There is some kind of an immovable foundation that Jesus is referring to. And if you go back to the nearest possible antecedent, it has to be Jesus as the Son of God. That's the immovable foundation. And such passages, well, like in Ephesians, that the church was built upon this foundation, rather to the Corinthians, he said. And upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. There's two possible ways to take this phrase, the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. What is the it? The fact that he would build the church. Nothing was going to stop the building of the church. Sometimes we extend that promise, I think in principle, but maybe not in the text here, but we extend that promise to say the devil can never destroy the church. You know why? He may wipe it off the face of the earth so far as locality, but the seed will always be there. The seed will be there. My grandmother, she lived on a little farm, and she had seeds galore everywhere. We'd always get our seeds from her. And she'd say, just take these home and plant them. Well, Mom and Dad were busy, didn't have time to plant them, and sometimes those seeds would sit for 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. You know what happened when they took one of the seeds and put it in the ground after 10 years? It still grew. And it grew exactly the same thing that the plant out of which that seed came. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. I will build my church. Let me just concentrate on that for a moment. I will build my church. Start at the back of that phrase and let's move toward the front, church. Notice the singular nature of it. I will build my church, not churches. Of course, I'm talking to an audience that understands the church is the body. There's one body. Hence, there's only one church. There's only one kingdom. We understand the distinctive nature of it. But he said, I will build my church. Back up a little bit further. I will build my church. It belongs to him. I've often used this illustration when teaching in English. I would say, to say, if I were to take a pen, for example, and I were to say, this is the pen, you're going to use your imagination here. I'm not losing my mind. I really have one. If I were to take that pen and I were to say, this is the pen of Tom Waycaster, it's the same thing as saying Tom Waycaster's pen. It's possessive. That doesn't work in Russia, I found out, in a lot of other countries. There's just one phrase. It belongs to him. It's possessive. I will build my church. Look at this. I will build. That's future tense. At the time Jesus spoke these words, the church was not in existence. Now here's the dummy question for the evening to this audience. When did the church begin? Somebody want to venture a guess? When did it begin? Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost. So it's future. It's not present. Then look at this. Let's back up one step further. I will build my church. It wasn't built by men. It was built by Christ. And that's because Jesus is divine, and it was a church that was in the eternal purpose of God. Ephesians chapter 3, verses 8 through 11. God planned it from all eternity. I will build my church. So upon the foundational confession that Peter made, that Jesus is the divine Son of God, he says he's going to build that church. I'll give unto thee the keys of the kingdom, verse 19. Doesn't mean that Peter had sole authority or that he was somehow above the other apostles. They were all given the same authority. But Peter was evidently given the privilege of opening the door to the kingdom for the first time among the Jews in Acts 2, and the first time among the Gentiles in Acts chapter 10. So he was very instrumental in opening those doors. And of course the other apostles did the same thing. All of this, this whole passage stresses the absolute authority of Christ. And therein is the great challenge in trying to teach men, is trying to get them to understand the authority principle. That Jesus is the authority. Most of the little Bible studies that we have, like Fishers of Men and Open Bible Study and others like that, one of the first things they do is they stress authority. And why it is that men can't grasp what I call the authority principle is a mystery to me. I was in India on one occasion, and we had a room full of denominational Indians there, and some were Hindus, but most of them were denomination. And I was trying to stress this aspect of authority. So I had Nehemiah Goodham set up a table, and we took about 10 objects and we set them on the table: a cell phone and an eraser and a piece of chalk and a pen and several other items. And so I said to one of the little girls sitting down at the front, I said, "Would you please bring me the book?" And she brings me the book. That's all she brought me. And when she sat down, I said, "Now, why did you not bring me the cell phone?" And she said, "You didn't ask for it." Do you see the authority principle? What does God tell us to do? He tells us to sing in the New Testament. He doesn't say sing and play. So if I'm going to follow the authority principle, I'm going to do just what He says. And we recognize that in almost every walk of life. You take a prescription to a doctor to have it fulfilled. You take the prescription from the doctor to a pharmacist. And how does the pharmacist treat that? He doesn't add to it and think that his grandmother's concoction is any better, or at least as good, and add to it. He doesn't take away from it. And so they recognize the authority principle. Mathematicians recognize the authority principle. This goes on and on. Why is it that men lose sight of that when it comes to religion? And the general thinking now is you can do whatever you want, whether it's right or wrong, just so long as you believe it's right. And in fact, you can even know it's wrong. And if you do it believing it's right, that somehow it's effective. Don't lose sight of this authority principle in this. It's a very important aspect. Let's go back to our outline. Let me pause. Now, if you're going to make some comments from way in the back, you're going to have to really speak up. I still haven't gotten this right ear corrected, and somebody said you don't have the right or the left one corrected yet, so I'm working on them. Any comments on any of this that we've covered so far before we move on? Observations? Okay, I gave you a chance. Let's go to the next section. I got to point it this way. Number 47 is the first prediction of His death. I'm going to touch on these very lightly. There were 3 predictions that Jesus made of His death, and I find it interesting that He doesn't really start becoming specific on a lot of the details until you get to the 3rd prediction of His death. He doesn't immediately include the crucifixion here. Look at Matthew 16:21, since we are in this chapter. From that time began Jesus to show unto His disciples that He must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and the 3rd day be raised. There's no mention of the crucifixion. There's no mention that He would be turned over to the Gentiles in order for that penalty to be carried out. But what really raises an interesting question here is, He's been with them 2 years. Why is He just now getting around to telling them about His death? Why does He wait so long? And why does He wait even longer, almost until the Passion Week arrives, before He gives them some even more details about His death? Here's my conclusion on that. I think that Jesus delayed telling them about His death because they weren't ready for it. It would have shattered their dreams until they had the kind of faith that would accept the reality of God's plan without question and then follow it through. And so He's going to start comforting them, and as you move toward the Passion Week, there's going to come a point in the ministry of Jesus where His teaching is almost exclusively to the disciples. What He's doing is He's shifting His attention away from the public masses for the most part. I'm not saying He doesn't teach any public masses from here on. He's turning His attention away from the public masses in order to teach His disciples. There were at least 2 reasons for that. One is the public masses had already demonstrated that by and large, they were going to reject the gospel. And then second of all was he needed to start encouraging his disciples to get ready for what is coming. And here's why he needed to do that. What if he had not foretold his death? Had never said anything about it, and then he's arrested and he's crucified. I think that would have had a detrimental effect upon their thinking and their faith in him. For they would reason, no doubt as humans would reason, why did he not tell us about that? Did he not know? And if he did not know, that puts a doubt in their mind as to the deity of Jesus. So you see its timing. Everything Jesus did was by design. There was no accident in any of that. Let's move to the next one, see if we can get at least part of this in here. I've got to remember which way to point this thing. I'm not real sure it's even working. Can y'all help me upstairs and get the next point up here? Well, I'll just tell you what it is. 48, the Transfiguration. Turn over to chapter 17. And chapter 17 is, I'm going to give you some thoughts about the Transfiguration. A number of years ago, I did a lesson on the Transfiguration, a sermon on it. And in order to introduce that, I took all the accounts of the Transfiguration and I combined them into harmony so that we could get every word of every passage into that rendering of the Transfiguration. And I want to take just a minute and read this compilation that I came up with. Now, let me suggest that you look at Matthew 17 and follow with me verses 1 through 8 and listen for the different words that I'm going to come up with. In other words, I used Matthew primarily, but I inserted all the other words somewhere where they would fit to try to give me a little bit better rendering of every word that Jesus spoke. Now, the alternate passages are Mark chapter 9, 1 through 8, and Luke 9, 28 through 36. And so far as the number of words, I think that Matthew's has the more number of words, but Luke's account is a little bit longer in the verses. Now I'm just going to read this, so follow with me. Keep your Bibles open into Matthew. Don't try to jump back and forth. And listen to what the three writers together give us. And after 6 days, Jesus taketh with him Peter and James and John his brother, and bringeth them up into a high mountain apart by themselves to pray. See, Matthew doesn't mention those. By themselves to pray. And as he was praying, the fashion of his countenance was altered, and he was transfigured before them, and his face did shine as the sun, and his garments became white as light, glistering, dazzling, exceeding white, so as no fuller on earth can whiten them. Look at the superlatives that are used by the writers to try to convey to us in human terminology and guided by the divine inspiration of the Holy Spirit to try to help us to maybe get a mental image of what's unfolding here. Imagine the brightest day that you can imagine and the brightest sun that ever shone. And somehow you end up looking straight into the sun and your eyes can't bear that. I think if you can imagine that kind of a scenario, you start to get the idea of how bright this must have been. Let me read on. And behold, there appeared unto him Moses and Elijah talking with him, who appeared in glory, spake of his decease, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now Peter and they that were with him were heavy with sleep, but when they were fully awake, they saw his glory, and the two men stood with them. And it came to pass, as they were parting from him, Peter answered and said unto Jesus, Lord, Rabbi, Master, it's good for us to be here. If thou wilt, I will make here 3 tabernacles, one for thee, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah, not knowing what he said. We got too many preachers in the pulpit today who don't know what they're saying. This is a little bit different situation. But he's an interesting character. He has a tendency to speak out sometimes and then maybe wish on occasions he had eaten his words. Well, I guess we all do that, don't we, sometimes? Don't we? So, not knowing what he said, for he knew not what to answer, for they became sore afraid. And while he was yet speaking, behold, there came a bright cloud overshadowing them, and they feared as they entered into the cloud. And behold, a voice out of the cloud, saying, This is my beloved Son, my chosen, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him. May I suggest to you those three words, hear ye him, is the very point that God was trying to get across. Jesus is the authoritative one. It's not Moses anymore. It's not Elijah. It's not what the prophets wrote, except that we learn from them. But for authority in what we do in religion, it's no longer Moses. Hear ye him. Listen to what he has to say. Hear ye him, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him. And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their face and were afraid. And Jesus came, touched them, and said, Arise, be not afraid. And lifting up their eyes, and suddenly looking around about, they saw no one save Jesus only. And they held their peace, and told no man in those days any of the things which they had seen. Now, immediately after this, they come down off of the mountain, they enter into the marketplace, and they're confronted with a lack of faith on the part of the other 9 apostles as they were being confronted by the man with the demons. But I want to just give you some practical lessons out of this very quickly as we have time. What do you learn from the Transfiguration? I learned, first of all, that this word transfiguration, the Greek word is the same word from which we get our English word metamorphosis. There was a change that took place in Christ. If you can, in your mind, imagine a caterpillar crawling into its cocoon, and some kind of a change takes place in there. And it comes out a most wonderful, beautiful creature. Turn over to Romans chapter 12. And I think about the transfiguration of Jesus as a type of what we are going to experience, and what we experience in some sense even here. But we experience it in a greater sense on the judgment day. Romans chapter 12. Let me get over there and I'll be all right. This is the practical section in Romans as he gets past the doctrine. Now listen to verse 1 and following. I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which your spiritual service. And be not fashioned according to this world, but be ye, do you see the word transformed? The same word. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. A theme that runs all the way through the Scriptures is the distinctive nature of the child of God. When you enter into the watery grave and you come out of that grave, you are transformed. You begin a process of a change in your life. And that change becomes more and more evident the further along you move in your Christian journey. Now, turn over to 1 John chapter 4. And in some sense, 1 John chapter 3, in some sense, we're going to be changed on the judgment day and take on this spiritual body, according to 1 Corinthians 15. We're going to take on this spiritual body, but we're not given full revelation as to what that's going to be like. Listen to John's words beginning with verse 1. 1 John 3 verse 1. Behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called the children of God, and such we are. The word such in my American Standard is italicized. Will you permit me to use a little exclamation and voice here? I know there's power in the written word, but sometimes maybe we can pick up a nuance in the wording if we watch the italicized words, and if we've done some study on how things are emphasized. Here's the way I think John put it. Behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called the children of God. And we are. Do you see the connotation in that? I think John was excited when he wrote this. If we can grasp that sense of change in our lives and what awaits us on the judgment day, we are the children of God now. And then we are going to be His children forever. Continue to read on, if you will. Verse 2, Beloved, now are we the children of God. It's not yet made manifest what we will be. We know that if He shall be manifested, we'll be like Him, for we shall see Him even as He is. There's some mystery that surrounds that even yet. And I don't have a lot of patience with people who try to explain what that changed body is going to be like now, because the Scriptures do not tell us. So what do? We live in faith and expectation that that will occur. But there's a transformation. So when I look at the transformation of Jesus, the transfiguration, though it's far beyond what you and I will ever experience, His transfiguration is a foretaste of what it's going to be like for us when we get to heaven. And things are going to be changed in an instant, in the twinkling of an eye. And well, you could get me off to preaching on heaven, and I'd have to go past the allotted time that's given to me. I think it's about time to quit. Did they ring a bell on us yet? They didn't? Oh, well, let me go a little bit further then. Let me give you a second lesson.